I'm Tori Bedford. Tonight on Greater Boston, I'll talk to New Hampshire public radio reporter Lauren Chooljian on her efforts to expose sexual abuse in the state's biggest addiction recovery center and the harassment she's faced since. Then later, the founder of the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute on Boston's efforts to prevent violent crime this summer. Broken windows, vulgar graffiti, and threats of more to come. New Hampshire public radio reporter Lauren Chooljian has faced all of it since she published a damning expose of a prominent figure in the state's addiction recovery community last year. The physical attacks have also been followed by legal ones in an effort to discredit her reporting, which revealed years of sexual abuse allegations against Eric Spofford, the founder of New Hampshire's largest addiction rehab network. Spofford has denied any involvement in the threats or vandalism, but reportedly sent Lauren, her editor, her station, and some of her sources a series of messages pressuring them to retract the story. When they didn't, he sued them for libel. As for the physical attacks, prosecutors charged 3 men for conspiring to harass Lauren and her editor, reportedly at the request of a, quote, close personal associate of Eric Spofford. As both cases play out, Lauren has expanded on her reporting in a new podcast series called The 13th Step. Lauren joins me now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Tori.
This has been, I can't imagine what you're dealing with right now and how chaotic it is, but I want to just take a step back and talk about the title of this podcast, this concept of the 13th step, which I wasn't familiar with.
No, me neither. And in fact, I have people in my life in recovery. I'm not in recovery myself, so I don't pretend to know everything about it, but I was struck that this is a thing that has been going on since the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous. So many people know, of course, that the 12 steps or the 12-step program are oftentimes the place where most people have found recovery. But it turns out that there's this kind of phrase that is used called the 13th step or 13th stepping, where someone who is further along in their recovery, insert verb here, preys on or hits on or wants to have a relationship with someone who is earlier in their recovery. And what we really talk about in the podcast is how early recovery is an extremely vulnerable time. I think we talk a lot about active addiction, right? And we know how difficult the brain is having a time trying to sort out the substances that are dealing with. People with active addiction are struggling, of course, but when you're trying to get your footing, and addiction, as we well know, is a chronic disease that is very complicated. And so if you're finally able to make the choice to try and find recovery, you're in a really vulnerable position where everything that maybe you've been trying to numb with drugs and alcohol is right in front of your face. You don't have that coping mechanism that you've been using for so long. And now suddenly you might be dealing with some sort of a consent situation where you feel like you don't even know who you are, and consent then becomes complicated. And so this idea of 13th stepping, if you ask anyone in recovery, they'll know exactly what it is. But it took me years of reporting to understand that what I was looking at here was not just one story about one guy in one treatment center, but this is an unfortunate phenomenon that many people in recovery have experienced.
And this guy, Eric Spofford, who is he?
So he's from New Hampshire, and New Hampshire, as you well know, Tori, has had a really hard time with the opioid crisis. We were one of the states hardest hit at the outset and are still dealing with it, just like many, many places are. So Eric was a guy who everyone looked to for a solution. In 2008, he started a small sober home in Derry, New Hampshire, and he did that because he himself is in recovery, and he devoted his life to helping other people find recovery. That one small sober home grew into this big network of treatment centers called Granite Recovery Centers, and that's the biggest addiction treatment network that we have in New Hampshire still to this day. Now, Eric has since sold the company, but during the time when he was founder and CEO, I later learned that this very positive recovery story that he put at the center of his business, that he devoted his life to helping people, that's not the only story about Eric Spofford that's out there. I've talked to dozens and dozens and dozens of people at this point, and many of them have shared with me allegations of whether it's sexual misconduct that they'd experienced or a toxic workplace. I even report, and as I had a news story and also later in the podcast, that multiple people quit Granite Recovery Centers because they heard an allegation that involved Eric Spofford, that involved sexual misconduct, where he sexually assaulted a woman who worked for him, who used to be a client at the recovery center, at Granite Recovery Center. So it's a complicated story. It's taken me years to report it, and we are here today, yes, with a podcast, but a lot of it started with the initial publishing of a news story about some of the allegations I had found. Eric, through a lawyer, denied all of these allegations of misconduct, and they also threatened to sue us if we pursued the story. We, of course, did publish the story, and like you just said, a few months later, Eric Spofford did sue me, 2 of my colleagues, and 3 of my named sources for defamation. So it's been a lot.
It's been at least 3 years of reporting, you mentioned.
Yeah, so it started in December of 2020 where I got a tip about the sexual misconduct allegations, but I wouldn't have gotten that tip if not for a story I did about an outbreak. They had a COVID outbreak. This was 2020, obviously. All of us were doing outbreak stories at that point. And because they were helping so many people with substance use disorder, an outbreak at this facility was certainly newsworthy. And when we put that story out, that's when I received a really astounding tip from a former clinician who alleged that she knew about sexual misconduct allegations and that she and other people quit because of what they heard. And so from that point on, so that was December of 2020, I had to do a lot of work to corroborate these stories. I mean, as you know, Tori, from reporting you've done, you don't just get an allegation and put it on the air, right? You have to do the best you absolutely can to fact check something that oftentimes there is no physical evidence, right? And so the process by which we corroborate these things is, did this person who experienced this tell anyone about it? And when did they tell? And is there anything else you can tell me about that time that shows you were there when you said you were? For example, one of the allegations I found was from a woman named Elizabeth who says she received explicit Snapchats from Eric the day after she left his treatment center. I should say Eric also paid for her to attend this treatment center. And so there was a really tough power dynamic there. Now, Snapchat, of course, those pictures don't save. She didn't take screenshots. Eric would have been notified if she had. That's how the app works, as you well know. And so, you know, I couldn't see the pictures, but she told people at the time. I also was able to corroborate from documentation from Granite Recovery Centers that she attended when she said she attended. So there are ways we can corroborate these things, but that's why it took so long. That has been since December 2020 till now.
Yeah, I want to get into that process, right, of corroborating, because I imagine there are so many people that you spoke to whose accounts you weren't able to use.
Yes.
And so it's frustrating, I imagine, on that end, right, to have spoken to so many people and then have the people who are corroborated and verified their credibility then questioned.
Yes.
Because those are the ones that actually made it to print or onto the podcast. But
yeah.
I want to talk about the allegations themselves. So you mentioned a little bit about the Snapchat and just graphic images that he sent. What are some of the other stories that you've heard from survivors?
Sure. So people will hear in the podcast about a woman we call Employee A, who we use a lot of pseudonyms in the podcast and in the initial reporting because a lot of people were afraid of legal retaliation or retaliation of any kind for coming forward. So Employee A, not in recovery, but worked at Granite Recovery Centers, one of their facilities. And she received similar Snapchats while working for Eric that Elizabeth also received. And she also told me that there was a day when she was working, during the workday, Eric called her in for a meeting in his office, and she alleges that he sexually assaulted her. And, you know, this is in his office in the middle of the workday. People, as Employee A said, were working right outside the door. And she told people that this happened, and I was able to corroborate it with them. Obviously, that's a really harrowing experience, and to share with a stranger and to then be worried about retaliation, I mean, that's a lot. And, you know, the legal retaliation they worried about and that we then end up facing, it's like their fears came true. You know, the day after that story came out, my news story with Employee A's allegation in it, she received what's known as a litigation hold letter, which I didn't know this at the time, but is like a housekeeping thing. Like, oh, you might be in litigation, so you should save everything, don't delete. Well, I didn't know what that was. She didn't know what that was. And so what you really see when you see this complicated legalese kind of thing on your phone is, am I being sued right now? And she had just done this big, courageous thing of coming forward, alleging that this awful thing had happened to her. And yeah, that's a lot for a person to experience. And so that's one allegation. Another allegation is from a woman who I didn't speak with, but multiple former employees of Granite Recovery Centers told me that she told them directly that she and Eric had a sexual relationship that wasn't always consensual, which of course is sexual assault. And she was a former client of Granite Recovery Centers as well. Eric would later tell a colleague that I spoke with that he settled with her. And so, you know, these are big, serious allegations. These are big, serious things in any industry. But I really wanted to take the time and care, especially with these allegations, because in this industry, this is an industry that's supposed to help people get well in a public health crisis. I mean, the stakes just couldn't be higher.
I wanted to ask about that, like what's being done, because one of your sources mentioned that she'd actually previously had a conversation with an FBI agent.
Yeah.
And the FBI agent said, well, you'd have to take that up with the cops. And I think she says, you are the cops, right? Like, who's going to help me in this scenario? And they were investigating something else related to finances, I guess. But how prevalent is this issue? Do you think that this spans beyond Granite Recovery Centers?
Oh, certainly. Oh, without a doubt. I mean, in fact, as I started to talk to other people about what I had found, I unfortunately heard from many other women who, didn't go to Granite Recovery Centers, but described situations to me where anytime they would enter a facility that was supposed to help them, I heard from women who made allegations about a food pantry. I heard from women who made allegations about the guy who drove them to detox for the first time. And you can hear some of this in the podcast. Unfortunately, sexual harassment, especially sexual misconduct, is prevalent, as we know as women, everywhere, but especially here, because people are in an exceedingly vulnerable position where they're often not believed, especially if they're not a man or if they are, in active recovery. They're not a person that society often, or active addiction, they're not a person that society often believes, unfortunately. And so, we've learned in the Me Too movement that obstacle on obstacle on obstacle is stacked against a person trying to make such a big allegation. Well, try being a person who's experienced addiction, who has substance use disorder, who oftentimes isn't believed, because sometimes when you're in active addiction, you have lied, trying to make yourself not withdraw. I mean, it is an exceedingly complicated situation, but I just have always believed that means we need to take extra care to help people deal with this chronic disorder. I mean, it's a lot. And no, there's not enough oversight. And no, there aren't enough, easy pathways to accountability. And so, you talk about employee A, it is true that it wasn't the FBI's jurisdiction to take on this sexual assault allegation. But when you're in a position of feeling like the person you're alleging is much more powerful than you, it feels like you don't know which pathway to take it or who's really going to believe you.
And that's been an argument that Eric Spofford has used, is that these are people in recovery and they're not necessarily credible.
Right.
Which is quite a thing for someone to say, right, having gone through that experience himself, to take away that agency from them. But he has publicly made those statements, and for you as a journalist, your responsibility is to trust but verify.
Right.
How did you navigate the issue of consent when you're, I know you've done a lot of political reporting, but this is Me Too kind of reporting, also the additional factor of working with folks who are experiencing substance use disorder. So there's a lot to navigate there in terms of establishing that trust and also making sure that you're not feeling as if you're coercing people to
come forward.
Right.
Yeah, the thing that I really focus on, honestly, is telling people it's their choice. Of course, as a reporter, I want as many people to come forward for the story. The more people in the story, the more credible. But I needed sources to understand what that would look like. Now, I could not tell them, and I think my house will get vandalized if the story, which we'll get to,
Yeah.
But what I can tell them is it is absolutely your choice. It's not good for me and it's not good for you if you decide that this isn't something you want to do, you're not comfortable coming forward. The most important thing for me is to establish trust. And I wanted sources to understand that, yeah, in a political reporting situation, if the mayor of wherever says to me, we're on the record, and then calls me later and says, no, we're not, that doesn't fly with me. That's a person in a position of power. In this case, yeah, there were many situations where women, as people we hear in the podcast, wanted to share something with me, did interviews with me, and then decided they couldn't do it. And frankly, that's their decision. It's their story. And, as difficult as that is, I just had to accept that because that's their life. And, it's a tough one though, right? You get really close, you spend all this time, and, but it was important to me that people knew what they were getting into. And sometimes that time, pays off, so to speak, right? I mean, I had a former HR director go on the record, use her real name. And she was an exceedingly important source because she had notes that backed up some of the conversations she had. And even with that, strong of corroboration for what she was sharing, it took a year for her to decide that was something that she was willing to do because she was so afraid of legal retaliation. And, it's a luxury that my station, a small station, afforded me that time to do that. But that's what you need in order to gain people's trust.
Those threats, or that looming threat of this powerful person retaliating, that did seem to pan out, right? I mean, let's talk about what happened after you published your first story, the attacks on you and your family.
Yeah, so the story came out in March of 2022. And then in April, I got a call from my parents that their house had been vandalized. I called my boss to tell him about it. Turns out his house had been vandalized. And then a third home that I used to live in Hanover, New Hampshire, was also vandalized. All very similar. C word spray painted in red on the door, in my parents' case, on their garage. A brick or rock thrown at the house. And at my parents' house, it broke the window. Same with the house in Hanover. And that was pretty awful, I think is the understatement. And not knowing why or how or what do you even do. And yet I'd never faced anything like this in my, 10-ish years now. We face harassment as journalists, but never like this. And so I then, a month later, am out of town, and my father calls me and says that it had happened again at their house. And my husband checks our security cameras, and sure enough, a brick had been thrown through my living room window, and the words "just the beginning" were spray painted ! Under the broken window.
And you have a young daughter.
I do have a young daughter.
Was there a point when you thought maybe I won't be continuing this? I mean, how does that make, the U.S. Attorney's Office for Massachusetts, they've now charged 3 men, but I think there's still this threat out there, right? Like, do you feel safe? Do you feel protective of her? Did it make you think about dropping this, not wanting to continue working on it?
I never considered stopping. Not because it's not scary, not because it's not intimidating, not because, it is intimidating. It is intense. And you know what? It was really hard for my sources. I had a conversation with employee A who made the sexual assault allegation, and she said that the scariest thing that happened was the vandalism at my house. That's a pretty profound thing for a reporter to have to share with a source and navigate together now.
Like, you don't want to become the story.
No,
right?
Certainly not.
Yeah.
And, that was her reaction. And that's really difficult. And it was difficult for my parents, and it's still difficult. But as you say, federal investigators have put together quite a case against 3 men, and I know the investigation is ongoing, so there's only so much I can say. But no, this reporting is important, and I wouldn't have put it out there if I didn't corroborate it. I think people need to understand how complicated this kind of reporting is, and it doesn't just happen overnight.
Yeah.
And, my lawyers looked at it.
Yeah.
I have fact checkers. This isn't just something I threw out there.
No, this is a years-long effort, and it's culminated in the podcast, The 13th Step. Thank you so much, Lauren Chooljian. Thanks for being on.
Thanks, Tori.
Next up, we hear it every year, that violent crimes spike in the summer. And last year was no exception. 12 people were killed in Boston between June and August. That's more than the entire first half of the year. And this year, murders are already on the rise, prompting the city to up its prevention efforts with an expansion of summer youth programs and trauma resources. But many community leaders are questioning whether those efforts will make a difference or really address the root of the problem. Leaders have also raised questions about the role of police in all of this, as the Attorney General's office investigates allegations of racial bias. My next guest has been working to prevent violence in Boston for decades as the founder and CEO of the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, named for her son who was killed by a stray bullet in 1993. Chaplain Clementina Cherry joins me now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, so I get so frustrated, and I imagine you get frustrated, but we start the summer and we hear about violence prevention, right? And then it seems like over the summer it's an issue and then people just forget about it. But you haven't forgotten about it ever. Like, it's not something that you ever stop thinking about. How does that, is that frustrating to kind of go through this again? And we're starting into the summer, right? And we're here, and that's how we're kicking off the segment, but.
It is. It's sad, it's re-triggering, and it's re-traumatizing because we tend to wait till the summer to talk about shootings. I know you said, 11 from June to August? Well, from January to May is 11, and then from September to December is 17 homicides. So the fact that we only wait for the summer to talk about the violence, it's one, minimizing and devaluing all those families who lost their loved ones before the summer and after the summer. So there has to be a way. We know this happens. I mean, 30 years and we're still focusing on the summer. And the young people that are being killed and that are killing were not even born when Lewis was killed. So we have to look at it from a holistic perspective. Are we ready for summer of 2024? And hopefully we're not waiting till June of 2024 to be saying and repeating the same thing.
What do you think of these new programs? Do you feel like are you hopeful about them at all? I mean, some of them are
always hopeful. I have to be hopeful. What I struggle with is we don't sustain. They're not sustainable. Every administration comes in, we're following with something different and not sustaining. And then programs come and go, people come and go, and those that are living the issue are still there, and it's not sustainable. So yes, I'm hopeful. I have to be hopeful. I have to be hopeful because this is my city, this is my community, and I am raising young black grandchildren, boys, and I don't want to wait for them to get in trouble to talk about providing support to them.
I want to talk about, you're doing this work to kind of reframe the way that people think about victims of homicide. Why is that important? And can you talk a little bit about like what it is that you're doing and working on with the foundation?
Well, it's important because we tend to always focus on individuals. We talk about, we want to focus on the gangs. The gangs belong to somebody. And the fact that you know somebody's a gang, it's painful for me to hear that. As mothers in the inner city, we don't raise our children to kill, and we don't raise them to be killed. So when Lewis was killed, and I heard that it was a drug deal gone bad. There was kind of this justification as to why he was killed and where he was killed. And then when they found out who he was, that he wanted to be the first black president, he had goals, dreams, and vision, then the narrative changed. And then the justification was, well, you know, unfortunately, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. These things happen. This is a hot spot. And I think for me, I didn't want to deal with that narrative anymore. I wanted to shift the narrative. One, to teach the value of peace, and two, to transform the way we respond to families of homicide victims. When we talk about numbers, it's one victim. We want to focus on the families that are left behind. And there are really no resources, or there weren't no resources back in 1993. And so for us, is working within the schools to equip the teachers to teach the value of peace, and then working with our city leaders, with the late Mayor Menino, all the different mayors, and our police commissioner, and our police department, and our hospitals to really transform the way society responds to homicide. We have developed the best practices in homicide response protocol within the city of Boston. Not trauma response, that's one. Homicide response protocol. Physically, nothing has happened to us. Internally, everything is happening to us. So we want to shift that narrative and not always focus on the problem. We have to focus on the solutions.
I wanted to talk about that profiling that you just mentioned, right? Because we talk about, you've heard from the district attorney's office now, they just released data that I think the concentration, the majority of violent crime occurs in Dorchester and in 4 neighborhoods, Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and Jamaica Plain. At the same time, you know, arrest rates have increased, and Boston has one of the biggest racial gaps for the homicide clearance rate, which is the amount of homicides that were solved by the police. And that's been kind of proportional. It's happening at the same time. How do you think that we can address that bias, right? Because we're right now talking as well about like looking into the gang unit allegations of racial bias since 2018. All of that to me seems really connected. We're looking at Boston and systemic racism and how that plays a role.
This is nothing new. This is nothing new. I think what happens is that there's no accountability. Every single year we have that same statement. Every district attorney has done it before Kevin Hayden. Every police commissioner has done it before. Every mayor has done it before. Every minister has done it before. The missing link is we know the answer. The Center for Disease Control's social ecological framework tells us in order to address the issue, intervention must happen at multiple levels. We continue to focus on a small number of people doing the harm. Well, for me is, who do they belong to? If there's a gang unit, if there's a gang database, they belong to somebody. How do we make sure that we're bringing those caregivers into that conversation? Because two things happen. They either end up dead, and then they're re-victimized, and the families are re-victimized because of the involvement, or they end up killing somebody, and that cycle of retaliatory violence continues to happen. So for me is where you guys, the news reporter, you have to go deeper and ask, why is it that every year at the same time we're getting the same narrative? When again, the victims were not even born. This is 30 years doing this, and it's still Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. So if we know that these are hot spots, research has told us that we can cool it down and begin to create P-zone. If this was Newton and Wellesley, we would not be doing this. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so the arrest rates are going to go high. The clearance rate is not happening because it's the same people that are shooting, that are killing. We don't trust government, we don't trust system, and so people are not going to come forward. One of the things that we have done and we are working with is we are creating a Unsolved Homicide Ambassadors group where mothers whose children have been murdered want to be and want to work with our police commissioner and our district attorney and our family resource officer to really begin to have these conversations, and we want to be a part of the solution. If we are not included in that, homicides rate will not be solved. Arrest rates will continue, and we also want to make sure that we bring in the caregivers of those that are pulling the trigger, that are on that gang database. The solution is really simple.
Well, thank you for your continued work, decades of work focusing on providing hope and creating solutions for people. We really appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm here to serve. I'm here to serve.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight. Come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. I'm Tori Bedford. Thanks for watching. Good night.